James and I went to Oregon, to a completely deserted village at the very edge of the peninsula. I wouldn't call it a resort. It was more of an empty place with dilapidated houses, lacking luxury and tourist noise. Friends had recommended we go there to refresh our relationship, a typical piece of advice for couples who have hit a pause. But for me, it was something more. I wasn't just looking for rest. I wanted to rethink my life, to find the meaning that had long been cast into the shadows. Maybe it was my last attempt to rid myself of the inner emptiness. When we arrived at the old house, the smell of salty sea air immediately filled my lungs. It was a house with cracked windows, paint peeling from the wind, and a floor that creaked with every step. It was so unwelcoming that there wasn't the slightest hint of comfort in it. But it was in this that I felt a strange relief. I didn't know why, but its abandonment seemed to mirror what was happening inside me. We went inside, the dim light from an old lamp and the shadows on the walls. Everything was foreign, but this house held an empty space that I so desperately needed. I'd like to say that I felt lonely here, but in truth, it was more a sense of liberation. Liberation from the noise, from the faces, from the endless conversations, from those very expectations that always weighed on me. Here I could be myself, but at the same time, I no longer knew who I was. James, as always, had already begun unpacking, deciding what to do, where to go, which restaurants to visit. He was focused on relaxation, on something light and carefree. Meanwhile, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. What if I didn't find the answers? What if I couldn't figure myself out? We came here with expectations, but I had the feeling that I was searching for something I wouldn't find. I went for a walk, trying to dissolve into this place. A windy path along the cliff, distant cries of seagulls. I stood at the edge, feeling how the cold air stripped away the remnants of the familiar. Sometimes I felt that if I just stayed here, I would find the answer I was looking for. But I didn't know what I was really searching for. My mother had always been the kind of person who could handle anything without wasting time. She immediately got to work organizing things. First, she booked a table at the nearest cafe. Then she made a list of all the possible places for walks and night parties. Every day was scheduled down to the minute. Everything had to be perfect, with no unnecessary movements or delays. James seemed satisfied, as always. In his world, everything was under control. And I couldn't find peace. I sat on the balcony, looking into the dark distance. The wind was tousling my hair, and I didn't want anything. I couldn't hold in the emptiness that was growing with every passing hour. I wanted to talk to James, but I couldn't. The words seemed to get stuck in my throat, meaningless. And then one day, during one of our walks, I met him. Kevin, my stepbrother. We hadn't seen each other in years, and the encounter was accidental, almost insignificant. But I immediately felt the tension filling the air, as if something more was hidden behind this fleeting collision. We walked down a narrow street, past old houses that had once been full of life, but now stood like forgotten monuments. I tried to act like I was comfortable, but Kevin was attentive to my state. He had always been able to read people, and I had always disliked it when people understood me too well. "You've changed," he said without turning around. "You've become too silent. I don't like it." I wanted to reply that everything was fine, that I was just tired of the hustle and bustle, but something in his tone made me fall silent. He turned to face me, and our eyes met. There was interest in his eyes, but also something more, something I couldn't understand. He didn't say anything specific, but I felt his words resonating with me, as if he knew what was happening inside. And then, at that moment, my mother appeared. As always, without hesitation, without unnecessary pauses, she approached and began talking about the next activity. And in the midst of this tirade, full of everyday concerns and small details, I felt the tension in the air dissipate. As if nothing had happened, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had frozen, that the air had become heavy. I couldn't understand what this feeling was. The next morning, I went to the local market with Kevin. James had gone to a football event, and although I should have felt relieved to be alone for a bit, something about this time alone with Kevin made me feel anxious. We walked in silence, exchanging only a few words here and there, while the wind tried to scatter my hair and the noise from the market swallowed up the whole town. Kevin was strange. With his messy hair, eyes hiding too much, and the way he carried himself as if he were always on the verge of revealing something, and I was his listener. He suddenly stopped by a small antique stall where old jewelry and books with yellowed pages lay. We stood next to each other, and his silence grew more and more insistent. "Have you ever thought that these things somehow affect us?" he asked unexpectedly, not looking me in the eye, but I could feel his words truly reaching me. I glanced at the old rings and lockets, but I couldn't focus. Why did I suddenly feel so uncomfortable? Why couldn't I shake the feeling that the whole market, like everything around us, was following his rhythm, his opinion? He continued, as if not expecting an answer. "You're always trying to run away from your feelings," he said calmly, as though he was just stating a fact. I froze. Inside me, everything flipped over, and I felt fear grow. How that small remark about my feelings became something much bigger than just words. Kevin spoke as if he could see straight through me, knew what was going on in my head, and, most frightening of all, I couldn't deny his truth. It felt like he wasn't just trying to understand me, he was testing something, probing. I didn't know how to respond. It seemed like an invisible barrier had formed between us, one that I couldn't cross, but at the same time I couldn't retreat. Every word he said felt like a mirror in which I saw not what I wanted, but what I had been avoiding. "You're wrong," I finally blurted out, but my words sounded as empty as my response. I didn't know what I truly felt, and this conversation felt like it was digging into the very depth of me. Kevin silently watched me, but his gaze was full of something I couldn't decode. I felt the tension rise, and the air around us grew heavier. We stood among old things, surrounded by objects that seemed so foreign and forgotten, but for me, in that moment, they were real. It was as if they had become part of my inner chaos. Without waiting for my answer, Kevin continued on his way, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that his words had affected me too deeply, that something had changed. Now, it didn't seem like all of this was a coincidence. That evening was different. It was a feeling of changes I couldn't control. James had gone to another local event. Football, as always, was on his list of things to do, and I stayed at home. When he left, leaving me alone, I felt a strange sense of freedom, though that moment was tinged with something uneasy. I hadn't planned to spend the evening alone, but at some point I realized that I didn't want to stay in the empty house. When I stepped out onto the balcony, Kevin was already there, sitting in the dark, as if he had been waiting for me to come out. His silhouette was outlined against the night sky, and something about that image felt unsettling. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. "You're not going out for a walk, are you?" he asked with a slight smile, but in his voice I sensed something more. I sat down next to him, not knowing exactly what to say. The air was cold, but it didn't bother me. I felt how this moment stretched into eternity, and strangely, something in it pulled me in. I couldn't tear my eyes away from his face, even though I knew it shouldn't have been like this. We didn't speak much, just sat next to each other, looking at the dark outlines of the trees and listening to the distant rumble of the ocean. Then, quite unexpectedly, his hand brushed mine. Simply and carelessly, it gently fell onto my wrist, as though the gesture held no significance. But to me it felt like a shock. It was cold, but I felt the blood rushing through my veins, how my entire body reacted to that simple movement in an unexpected way. I don't know how much time passed before I finally said, "What do you want from me, Kevin?" The words slipped out on their own, as if they had been waiting for the moment to leave my lips. I couldn't hide the tension that had filled me. He was silent for a long time, as if weighing my words before responding. His gaze was deep and unyielding, and I felt as if he were looking straight into me, into the darkest corners of my mind. "I don't know," he finally said. His voice was quiet, but it held so much hidden meaning that I couldn't help but feel it. probably to understand who you really are." Those words were like fire, burning without a scorch, but leaving a mark. I felt everything inside me tighten, as if I were standing on the edge, needing to step forward or retreat. But I couldn't. I couldn't not sit next to him, not look at his face, not feel how his words wrapped around me. The silence between us grew thick, like a wall. I didn't know what I felt, passion, fear, or something else, but I could feel the uncontrollable chemistry between us growing, how it seeped into every moment of our silence, and I understood that I couldn't sit like this anymore, couldn't ignore the fact that these feelings didn't disappear just because I was trying to block them out. He kept sitting next to me, his hand still on my wrist. I didn't pull it away, because despite everything that was happening, it was hard to shake the feeling that lingered. That evening became a turning point. We sat in the darkness on the balcony, and despite the coolness of the night, the air was heavy, as if everything around us had faded into the background. The words were absent, but their absence spoke much louder. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I could feel how each glance from Kevin left a mark on me, as if we were two opposing forces that could no longer exist in peace. After his hand touched mine, I couldn't regain my calm. It was a moment that was hard to explain. I wasn't sure what he meant, or what I even wanted from him, but everything inside me seemed to flip. It felt like I was on the edge of something that could destroy everything I knew and everything I loved. I stood up to escape this trap, to step out and walk, even for just a few minutes. I needed to be alone to figure myself out. It was dark at night, and the path along the beach seemed deserted, just like my thoughts. The waves crashing against the rocks sounded muffled, and the icy wind pierced through me. But I didn't stop. It wasn't because I wanted to walk, but because I couldn't stand still. I couldn't stop and not try to think about what was happening. I walked for so long that I didn't even notice when silence took over. Some distant, empty silence in which I was myself, yet couldn't figure out what to do with myself. All this time, the only thing that spun in my head was that I had to leave. I had to escape these thoughts, this misunderstanding that was burning me from the inside. And then I heard his footsteps. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but I knew he was following me. I didn't turn around, didn't stop. I just kept walking forward because I couldn't go back. Kevin approached, and his presence, though silent, was relentless. "Are you running from yourself?" His voice was low, without any accusation, more like a question to which I had to find the answer myself. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. In that moment, I realized I shouldn't avoid myself. I couldn't keep running away. This was bigger than just words. It was my struggle. I was on the edge of acceptance, but I couldn't fully believe it yet. Kevin stayed next to me, not coming closer, but his presence grew even more palpable. I remained silent because I couldn't find the words to explain to myself what I was feeling. And maybe, in that silence, he knew that I wasn't ready to face my truth. But he kept standing there. Everything around us was empty, but there was a truth in that. I looked at him but couldn't meet his gaze. It was too painful, too revealing. He knew that I wasn't ready, that I was still trying to understand myself. But he didn't tire of waiting, as if he knew that this night would be the moment when I had to make a choice. I couldn't answer him because I didn't know what to do. I should have left, but I stayed, as if living on the edge between what was and what could be. That moment, it froze. In silence, under the sound of the waves, I understood. I could no longer run from this. The morning brought a new weight. I woke up to the sound of the door slamming as James returned from the local festival. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and inside me, everything remained as grim and clouded as it had been the night before. I could feel the storm inside me was still raging. James was in the mood for a normal day, as usual. He was full of energy, not noticing that I was barely holding myself together, struggling not to fall apart. We walked through the local market, which was crowded with people, and I pretended that everything was fine. I tried to smile, to talk, but inside me was such a storm that it felt like I could explode at any moment. We returned home, and when the door slammed behind us, everything became too clear. James looked at me and immediately realized something was wrong. I sat down on the couch and he stayed standing watching me. His gaze was sharp, discerning, but there was no anger in it. Only some confusion. He remained silent, and I felt how much harder it was becoming for me to hide anything. I couldn't keep it in anymore because I couldn't live with the lie that everything was fine. I finally looked up and met his gaze. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice trembling. He froze, as if waiting. I didn't know where to start, but it was inevitable. I talked to Kevin," I said. The words sounded like a verdict. I saw his face change, his muscles tense. He didn't move, but his eyes grew colder. "Are you serious?" His voice was calm, but I could hear the pain in it, and it made it hard to breathe. "You knew it would be wrong, but you still—" "I didn't want to." "You betrayed me." His voice was firm, like stone. I saw the pain in his eyes shift into something heavier, something I couldn't name. I knew I couldn't hide the truth anymore, but this truth tore me apart. It was hard even to think about what had happened because maybe at this point it no longer mattered. "I can't believe this." His words were sharp, like a blow. He wasn't shouting, but there was such steel in his tone that I couldn't stand my ground. I felt how hard it became to stand before him. In his eyes, I saw the kind of pain that, maybe, I would never be able to heal. And despite all my attempts to explain, everything I said seemed meaningless. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get him back. All I knew was that what was said couldn't be taken back. This moment froze, and I understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The days passed, but time here, in this desolate place, moved differently. Everything felt heightened. We lived as though in a fog, trying to follow familiar paths, but each step, each glance left a mark that didn't fade. Despite our efforts to maintain normalcy, I felt the gap between James and me growing. We avoided direct conversations. I avoided his eyes, and even the simplest words began to feel strange and out of place. It was hard for me to look him in the face. He was in his own world, absorbed in his thoughts, just like I was, but we both knew that nothing could return to its place. All these days, we tried to hold on to what once was. But over time, I began to notice how he was distancing himself, how his smiles became forced, how even his glances no longer sought comfort in me. And I could feel myself slowly losing him. More and more, I found myself in conversations with Kevin. We met by accident, crossing paths at the market, on walks. But the words between us were becoming more intense. Kevin talked about what I was feeling, as though he were my mirror, and I couldn't escape it. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at me not just as a woman or a sister, but as a mystery he was trying to solve. And I was starting to understand that his questions touched on what I was hiding inside, things I hadn't dared to think about. One evening, when I was again with him on the balcony, he said, "You know that all these conversations aren't accidental, don't you? You're constantly trying to avoid what's really happening inside you. You need to learn to be honest, not just with yourself, but with those around you." His words hung in the air. I remained silent, unsure of how to respond. It felt like a blow, but at the same time, I knew he was right. I was tangled up, afraid to even admit to myself what I truly felt, and at some point I realized that I couldn't continue lying to myself and to James. That night when we sat on the train to go to another city, I knew everything would be different. I had to be honest with James. I had to admit everything that had built up inside. He was silent, and perhaps he too understood that these few days, spent in the shadow of silence and uncertainty, could no longer continue. The train sped on, and I sat next to him, feeling how each meter took me further from what was, and brought me closer to what should be. I told myself that I needed to tell him the truth. Everything I had been hiding, everything that had been tormenting me, had to come out. We sat there in the train, amidst the noise and conversations of passengers, and in that crowded space, I felt so quiet, so alone. He looked at me and said, "Let's start over." But honestly, only then can we move forward. Those words were like a bright ray cutting through the darkness. It was the moment when I realized that not everything was lost, that if we started with honesty, if we were open with each other, we could find our way back. But I also knew that it would be hard. He was right. We needed to let go of all that had hurt in order to move forward. We sat together, and despite all the heaviness, I felt how our connection, though fragile, was taking shape again. We both understood that everything we had been through wouldn't disappear in a day, but the first step had been taken, and that meant we could move on. Eventually, we arrived in the city we had talked about. It was different. Calm, without unnecessary bustle, but it had a sense of the power of time, as if it knew all human suffering and joy. We walked through its streets in silence, but I could already feel how each step brought something new.